Jewish American organized crime emerged within the American Jewish community during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It has been referred to variously in media and popular culture as the Jewish mob, Jewish mafia, kosher mafia, kosher nostra, or unser shtick, Yiddish, Hebrew letter Aleph, Hebrew letter Vav, Hebrew letter Nun, Hebrew letter Dala, Hebrew letter Zayin, Hebrew letter Ayin, Hebrew letter Resh, Hebrew letter Shin, Hebrew letter Tet, Hebrew letter Yod, Hebrew letter Kov. The last two of these terms are direct references to the Italian Cosa Nostra. The former is a play on the word kosher, referring to Jewish dietary laws, while the latter is a direct translation of the Italian phrase Cosa Nostra, Italian for our thing, into Yiddish, which was at the time the predominant language of the Jewish diaspora in the United States. In the late 19th century in New York City, Monk Eastman, who himself was most likely not Jewish, operated a powerful Jewish gang that competed with Italian and Irish gangs, notably Paul Kelly's 5 Points Gang, for control of New York City's underworld. Another notorious gang, known as the Lenox Avenue Gang, led by Harry "Gyp the Blood" Horowitz, consisted of mostly Jewish members and some Italian members, such as Francesco Cirofisi. It was one of the most violent gangs of the early 20th century and became famous for the murder of gambler and gangster Herman Rosenthal. In the early 1920s, stimulated by the economic opportunities of the Roaring Twenties, and later Prohibition, Jewish organized crime figures such as Arnold Rothstein were controlling a wide range of criminal enterprises, including bootlegging, loan sharking, gambling, and bookmaking. According to crime writer Leo Katcher, Rothstein transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business, run like a corporation, with himself at the top. Rothstein was allegedly responsible for fixing the 1919 World Series. At the same time, the Jewish bootlegging mob known as the Purple Gang dominated the Detroit underworld during Prohibition, while the Jewish Bugs and Meyer mob operated in the Lower East Side of New York City before being absorbed into Murder, Incorporated and becoming affiliates of the Italian-American Mafia. The largely Jewish-American and Italian-American gang known as Murder, Incorporated and Jewish mobsters such as Meyer Lansky, Mickey Cohen, Harold "Hooky" Rothman, Dutch Schultz, and Bugsy Siegel developed close ties with and gained significant influence within the Italian-American Mafia, eventually forming a loosely organized, mostly Jewish and Italian criminal syndicate known in the press as the National Crime Syndicate. Jewish and Italian crime groups became increasingly interconnected in the 1920s and 1930s, as they often occupied the same neighborhoods and social statuses of the time. The two ethnic crime groups became especially close in New York City following the establishment of the close relationship between partners Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky and their subsequent elimination of many of the so-called Mustache Pete types, Sicilian-born gangsters who often refused to work with non-Italians and even non-Sicilians. The Cohen crime family of Los Angeles and Las Vegas was notably a part of both the Jewish Mafia and Italian-American Mafia, and lines between the two ethnic criminal organizations often blurred throughout the 20th century. For decades after, Jewish American mobsters would continue to work closely and at times compete with Italian-American organized crime. Origins and characteristics. Jewish American gangsters were involved in many different criminal activities, including murder, racketeering, bootlegging, prostitution and narcotics. Their role was also significant in New York's burgeoning labor movement, especially the garment and trucking unions, as well as the poultry industry. Jewish organized crime fueled anti-Semitism and deeply concerned the Jewish community. Jewish organized crime was used by anti-Ismailites and anti-immigration supporters as arguments to bolster their agenda. Jewish gangs controlled portions of the Lower East Side and Brownsville in New York City, and were also present in other major American cities. American Jewish Mafia boss Kid Ken held sway over Minneapolis for over 4 decades and remains the most notorious mobster in the history of Minnesota. Jewish American organized crime was a reflection of the ethnic succession among gangsters, which has tended to follow the immigrant waves in the United States. English, German, Irish, Jewish, Italian, Asian and Latino. Ethnic involvement in organized crime gave rise to alien conspiracy theories in the U.S. law enforcement community, in which the conception of organized crime as an alien and united entity was vital. The involvement of a small percentage of recent immigrants in organized crime created a lasting stereotype of devious immigrants corrupting the morality of native-born Americans. Organized crime was a complex set of relations between the recently arrived Jewish and Italian criminals and groups like the Irish American organized crime networks, which had been established before the 1920s and which the newer groups were sometimes subordinate to, although never receiving close to the level of cultural attention of the Italian American mafia. From the late 1960s, Jewish American gangsters would figure as characters in Jewish American literature. For some writers, Jewish gangsters and boxers in the post-World War II era were seen as tougher, more aggressive literary role models, freeing the community from the stigma of defenselessness and powerlessness, compared with the physical aggressiveness and lawlessness more associated with the Irish and Italian immigrants. According to Rich Cohen, author of Tough Jews, Fathers, Sons and Gangster Dreams, if Jewish gangsters still thrived today, if they hadn't gone legit, if Jews of my generation didn't regard them as figments, creatures to be classed with Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, I think the Jewish community would be better off. However, Cohen's description of Jewish gangsters ignores their criminality and immorality. These tough characters were still gangsters who extorted, exploited and murdered other members of the Jewish American community for profit. They forced Jewish women into prostitution, and were generally considered a scourge within their own community. The Yiddish press and literature of the 1920s and 1930s were resolute in their condemnation of Jewish mobsters. History. 19th century to early 20th century. A large wave of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced Jewish mobsters such as Max, Kid Twist, Zverback, Big Jack Zelig, and Vok, Cyclone Louis Lewis, who competed with and were acknowledged by Italian and Irish gangs. Just as with their Italian counterparts, gangs specializing in extortion began operating in the heavily Jewish neighborhoods of New York's Lower East Side, most prominently the so-called Yiddish Black Hand headed by Jacob Levinsky, Charles "Charlie the Cripple" Litovsky, and Joseph Toplinsky. During the early 20th century, a significant Jewish underworld already existed in New York at the start of the 20th century, with Jewish mobsters conversing in a jargon with Yiddish origins. A pimp was known as a simcha, a detective as a shamus, and a loafer as a trombonik. Jewish American organized crime rose among slum kids who as prepubescents stole from pushcarts, who as adolescents extorted money from store owners, who as young adults practiced clamming, wielding an iron pipe, wrapped in newspaper, against striking workers or against scabs, until as adults they joined well-organized gangs involved in a wide variety of criminal enterprises boosted by prohibition. The lure of quick money, power, and the romance of the criminal lifestyle was attractive to both second-generation Jewish and Italian immigrants. There was a supposed Jewish crime wave in early 20th century New York. In disturbing numbers, young Jews had joined crime rackets, it was said, along with children of Irish, Italian and other immigrants. However, the supposed Jewish immigrant crime wave may have been exaggerated by the press and law enforcement. Crime and population figures show that Jews in New York committed crimes at a rate far below the average for the wider society. As described by sociologist Steven Steinberg, less than a sixth of the city's felony arrests were Jews during the 1920s, when Jews constituted nearly a third of the city's population. As the 20th century progressed, Jewish American mobsters such as Dopey Benny Fine and Joe the Greaser Rosenzweig entered labor racketeering, hiring out to both businesses and labor unions as strong-arm men. Labor racketeering, or labor slugging as it was known, would become a source of conflict as it came under the domination of several racketeers, including former 5 Points gang members Nathan Kid Dropper Kaplan and Johnny Spanish during the Labor Slugger Wars, until its eventual takeover by Jacob Gora Shapiro in 1927. Other Jewish organized crime figures involved in controlling labor unions include Moses Annenberg and Arnold Rothstein, the latter reportedly responsible for fixing the 1919 World Series. Prohibition. According to crime writer Leo Katcher, Rothstein transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business, run like a corporation, with himself at the top. According to Rich Cohen, Rothstein was the person to see during Prohibition, 1920-1933, if one had an idea for a tremendous business opportunity, legal or not. Rothstein understood the truths of early 20th century capitalism, hypocrisy, exclusion, greed, and came to dominate them. According to Cohen, Rothstein was the Moses of Jewish gangsters, a rich man's son, who showed the young and uneducated hoodlums of the Bowery how to have style. Lucky Luciano, who would become a prominent boss within the Italian-American mafia and organize New York's 5 families, once claimed that Arnold Rothstein taught me how to dress. The stereotypical attire of the American mobster portrayed in movies can partially trace its roots directly to Rothstein. During Prohibition, Jewish gangsters became major operatives in the American underworld and played prominent roles in the distribution of illegal alcohol and the spread of organized crime throughout the United States. At the time, Jewish gangs operated primarily in America's largest cities, including Cleveland, Detroit, Minneapolis, Newark, New York City, and Philadelphia. Numerous bootlegging gangs such as the Bug and Meyer Mob, headed by Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and Abe Bernstein's Purple Gang, would see the rise of Jewish American organized crime to its height. Other Jewish mobsters, including Dutch Schultz of New York, Mo Dalitz of Michigan, Kid Can of Minneapolis, Charles King Solomon of Boston, and Abner Long Zwillman, the Al Capone of New Jersey, became wealthy during Prohibition. During this time, Luciano successfully eliminated the Old World Sicilian mafia bosses like Joe Masria and Salvatore Maranzano in the 1931 Castellamarese War and took control of the New York Italian mafia. Luciano did not discriminate against Jews and valued longtime associates such as Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Several Jewish gangsters such as Red Levine and Bo Weinberg were used in the war as unsuspected non-Italian hitmen. After Masria and Maranzano were murdered, a conference was held at New York's Franconia Hotel on November 11, 1931, which included Jewish mobsters such as Jacob Shapiro, Louis Lepke Buchalter, Joseph Doc Stasher, Hyman Curly Holtz, Louis Shadows Gravitz, Harry Teitelbaum, Philip Little Farville Kovalik, and Harry Big Greenie Greenberg. During this meeting, Luciano and Lansky convinced the Jewish American mobsters of the benefits of cooperating with the Italian-American mafia in a newly created consortium called the National Crime Syndicate by the press. At the meeting's conclusion, Bugsy Siegel supposedly declared, "The Ids and the Dagos will no longer fight each other." Those Jewish gangsters hostile to the idea of cooperation with non-Jewish rivals gradually receded. Most notably Philadelphia bootlegger Wakesie Gordon, who was convicted and imprisoned for tax evasion based on evidence provided to United States Attorney Thomas E. Dewey by Lansky. Following Gordon's imprisonment, his operations were assumed by Nig Rosen and Max Boohoo Huff. During Prohibition, Mo Dalitz established the Cleveland Syndicate with fellow Jewish gangsters Louis Rothkopf, Maurice Klein, Sam Tucker, Charles Paul Izzy, and Irish gangster Black Jack McGinty. Charles Paul Izzy was born Leo Berkowitz to Jewish biological parents who died when he was an infant. Charles was adopted by the Paul Izzy family, and his adoptive brother, Alfred Paul Izzy, was the head of the Italian Mayfield Road mob. The syndicate was heavily involved with bootlegging on Lake Erie and developed what was known as the Little Jewish Navy. The syndicate operated casinos in Youngstown, northern Kentucky, and Florida. The syndicate attended the Atlantic City Conference representing Cleveland. The syndicate ran numerous casinos in Newport, Kentucky, including the original Flamingo and Tropicana. The syndicate's reign in northern Kentucky came to an end following a botched attempt to discredit George Ratterman, a candidate for sheriff, and a federal crackdown during the Kennedy administration. The Cleveland syndicate members were early investors in the Desert Inn in Las Vegas and owned it until it was purchased by Howard Hughes. Its members invested in horse tracks including River Downs, Fairgrounds Racecourse, Thistledown Racecourse, Fairmount Park Racetrack, Aurora Downs, and the Agua Caliente Racetrack. Under Lansky, Jewish mobsters became involved in syndicate gambling interests in Cuba, Miami, and Las Vegas. Buchalter would also lead the predominantly Jewish Murder, Incorporated as the Luciano Meyer Syndicate's exclusive hitmen. After World War II, for several decades after World War II, the dominant figures in organized crime were second-generation Jews and Italians, often working in concert. As late as the 1960s, Jewish presence in organized crime was still acknowledged, as Los Angeles mobster Jack Dragna explained to hitman and later government informant Jimmy Fradiano. Meyer's got a Jewish family built along the same lines as our thing, but his family's all over the country. He's got guys like Lou Rohde and Dulitz, Doc Stacker, Gus Greenbaum, sharp fucking guys, good businessmen, and they know better than try to fuck us. Jewish mobsters, such as Meyer Lansky and the Los Angeles-based Mickey Cohen, along with Harold "Hooky" Rothman, continue to hold significant power and control organized crime groups in New York City, New Jersey, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and Las Vegas, while the Jewish-American presence remains strong in Italian-American criminal rackets. Shandor Burns was a Jewish crime boss in Cleveland, who controlled numbers, prostitution, theft, and gambling rackets. Burns was active until 1975, when he was murdered by Irish gangster Danny Green. Jewish American organized crime derived from dislocation and poverty, where language and custom made the community vulnerable to undesirables, the sort of thing that fosters criminality among any other ethnicity in a similar situation. As American Jews improved their conditions, the Jewish thug and racketeer either disappeared or merged into a more assimilated American crime environment. American Jews quietly buried the public memory of the gangster past. Unlike the mafia, famous Jewish American gangsters like Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, and Bugsy Siegel founded no-crime families. Much like Irish Americans and other ethnicities, with the exception of Italian-American criminal organizations, Jewish American presence in organized crime began to decline after World War II. Jewish American individuals remain closely associated with organized crime, especially Italian American and Israeli organized crime, but the Jewish American criminal organizations and gangs which once rivaled the Italian and Irish American mobsters during the first half of the 20th century have largely faded. Late 20th century to present. In more recent years, Jewish American organized crime has reappeared in the form of Orthodox Jewish, Israeli, and Jewish Russian mafia criminal groups. From the 1990s until 2013, members of the New York divorce coercion gang kidnapped and tortured Jewish men in troubled marriages in order to force them into granting religious divorces to their wives, in some cases extorting money from them. Described by prosecutors as a criminal syndicate that was akin to the Bloods, the Crips, or the Mafia, the organization, which charged up to $100,000 for their services, was shut down in the wake of a sting operation orchestrated by the FBI. While some tried to draw a distinction between the actions of the well-organized operation described by prosecutors and traditional kidnapping cases coming before judges that involved murder, terrorism, or child abduction, Judge Frieda Wolfson said she didn't see any difference. Epstein was sentenced in 2015 to 10 years in prison, and Walmark was sentenced to more than 3 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. In another development, A 2016 Stank-collared Aaron Goldberg and Shimon Leibowitz, two Satmar Hasidic Jews who were part of what the Forward described as the Orthodox divorce underworld. The pair had colluded with a third man to perform a contract killing on an estranged husband. Jewish American organized crime in Israel. Several notable Jewish American mobsters provided financial support for Israel through donations to Jewish organizations since the country's creation in 1948. Jewish American gangsters used Israel's law of return to flee criminal charges or face deportation. Notables include Joseph "Doc" Stasher, who built up Las Vegas by pairing the Jewish and Italian mafia into a national organized crime syndicate. Prime Minister Golda Meir set out to reverse this trend in 1970, when she denied entrance to Meyer Lansky. He was the mob's accountant, thought to be among the most powerful people in the country, with a gambling empire stretching throughout the United States. In 2010, it was reported by WikiLeaks that the United States Embassy in Israel, in a cable titled "Israel, the Promised Land of Organized Crime," had expressed grave concern about the activities of Israeli organized crime figures, and was taking measures to prevent members of crime families from being issued visas to the United States. American diplomats expressed concern that Inbal Gavrieli, the niece of one of Israel's most powerful mafia bosses, had been elected to the Knesset as an MK for Likud. Russian and Israeli mafia in the United States. The Soviet and Russian immigrant community in New York's Brighton Beach contains a large Jewish presence. Some of these newer American-based Jewish gangsters, such as Ludwig Feinberg, who has lived in Ukraine, Israel and the United States, but never in Russia, share more in common culturally with Russia and the Soviet republics than their predecessors, such as Meyer Lansky. Russian Jewish mafia figures, such as Semyon Mogilevich, have attempted to penetrate the United States, including participating in a $10 billion money laundering scheme through the Bank of New York in 1998. Israeli mobsters also have had a presence in the United States. The Israeli mafia, such as the Abergil crime family, is heavily involved in ecstasy trafficking in America. Notable members and associates: Abe Bernstein, leader of the Jewish American Purple Gang; Isidore Blumenfeld, Minneapolis crime boss; Meyer Mickey Cohen, Los Angeles crime boss; the Cohen crime family; Edward Monk Eastman, New York's crime boss; George Freeman, Sydney's crime boss and Lansky's associate; Meyer Lansky, Jewish American mob boss; Abe Reels, most feared hitman of Brooklyn-based Murder, Inc.; Arnold Rothstein, New York's crime boss; Dutch Schultz, Newark's crime boss; Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, casino owner and Las Vegas crime boss; Mo Delitz, and Louis Rothkopf, heads of the Cleveland Syndicate; Alex Shondor Burns, Cleveland Jewish crime boss; Abner Zwilman, New Jersey American Jewish crime boss. See also Abergil crime family, Israeli mafia, list of Jewish American mobsters. Luck TV series, Magic City TV series, Murder, Incorporated, Once Upon a Time in America, Russian Mafia, Zwi Migdal. Notes. References. Sources: Block, Alan A. 1976. Lepke, Kid Twist, and the Combination, Organized Crime in New York City, 1930–1944. Cohen, Rich, 1999. Tough Jews, Fathers, Sons, and Gangster Dreams, London. Vintage, ISBN 0-09-975791-5. Taview in the New York Times. Eisenberg, Dennis, Dan Urey and Eli Landau, 1979. Meyer Lansky, Mogul of the Mob, New York. Paddington Press. Fried, Albert, 1980. The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Gangster in America, New York. Holt, Reinhardt and Winston, ISBN 0-231-09683-6. Henderson Clark, Donald, 1929. In the Reign of Rothstein, New York. The Vanguard Press. Jose Litt, Jed Weissman. Our Gang, Jewish Crime and the New York Jewish Community, 1900–1940. Bloomington, Indiana University Press. 1983. ISBN 0-253-15845-1. Kraus, Joe. 2019. The Kosher Capones. A History of Chicago's Jewish Gangsters. Northern Illinois University Press. Rockaway, Robert A. 1993. But He Was Good to His Mother. The Lives and Crimes of Jewish Gangsters. Jerusalem. Geffen Publishing House. Ross, Ron, 2003. Bummy Davis vs. Murder, Incorporated. The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Mafia and an Ill-Fated Prizefighter. New York, St. Martin's Press. ISBN 0-312-30638-5. Reviewed and forward. Rubin, Rachel, 2000. Jewish Gangsters of Modern Literature, Chicago, University of Illinois Press. Rubin, Rachel, 2002. Gangster Generation, Crime, Jews and the Problem of Assimilation, Shofar, an Interdisciplinary Journal of Jewish Studies. Volume 20, Number 4, Summer 2002, pages 117. Russo, Gus, 2006. Supermob. How Sidney Korshak and his criminal associates became America's hidden power brokers, New York. Bloomsbury, reviewed in the New York Times. Reviewed and forward. Sadowski, Sandy, 1992. Wedded to Crime. My Life in the Jewish Mafia. Sifakis, Carl, 2005. The Mafia Encyclopedia, 3rd edition, New York. Facts on file. ISBN 0-8160-5694-3. Tashes, Nick, 2005. King of the Jews. The Arnold Rothstein Story, London. Hamish Hamilton. ISBN 0-241-14144-3. Weissman Joseph, Gina, 1983. Our Gang, Jewish Crime and the New York Jewish Community, 1900-1940, Bloomington, Indiana University Press. Reviewed in the New York Times. External links. New Voices. Left Off the Ark. A bestiary of gangs. Jewish gangsters at the Jewish Virtual Library. Seize the Night. The Jewish Mafia Farbreakers in America. The Americanization of Jewish Blue-Collar Crime. 1900-1931. The Papers of Detective Abraham Schoenfeld, who infiltrated and documented Jewish crime rings, prostitution houses and gambling establishments on Manhattan's Lower East Side from 1912 to 1917. Abraham Schoenfeld Papers, p. 884. American Jewish Historical Society, Boston and New York.